The dust devil swirled through Mercy Creek's main street as Sarah Running Deer stumbled into town, her torn dress clinging to wounds that told a story no decent person wanted to hear. The townspeople turned their backs, shuttering their windows against her desperate pleas. All except one man, gruff cattle rancher Jacob Mueller, whose weathered hands had known their own share of rejection. When he offered her shelter, the whole town whispered it would be his ruin. They had no idea that this single act of mercy would bring something to their doorstep that would change everything they thought they knew about justice, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. What happens when a small act of kindness awakens a force more powerful than any sheriff's badge or judge's gavel? Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this story of unexpected redemption will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the Old West. The twist in Chapter 4 will give you chills. Don't miss it. The September sun beat down mercilessly on Mercy Creek, Texas, as if the heavens themselves had turned their back on the small frontier town. Jacob Mueller guided his weathered wagon down the rutted main street, the wooden wheels creaking a familiar rhythm that had marked his weekly trips to town for the past 15 years. At 52, Jacob's face bore the deep lines of a man who had wrestled with both the harsh prairie winds and harder life circumstances, his graying beard concealing scars from battles he rarely spoke about. The town stirred uneasily around him. Shopkeepers lingered in their doorways longer than usual, their eyes scanning the horizon with an anxiety that had settled over Mercy Creek like morning fog for the past 3 days. Women hurried their children along the wooden sidewalks, casting nervous glances toward the hills beyond town, where Apache smoke signals had been spotted dancing against the sky. Jacob noticed the tension, but paid it little mind. His ranch, the Broken Wheel, sat 12 miles north of town, far enough from the gossip and close enough to trouble to suit his temperament perfectly. He'd come to Mercy Creek as a young man, with nothing but determination and a stubborn German work ethic, carving his spread from unforgiving land that had broken lesser men. Now, his cattle grazed on 3,000 acres of hard-won grass, and his reputation as a fair but solitary man preceded him wherever he went. As he pulled up before Hutchinson's general store, the normal bustle of commerce seemed muted. Store owner Ben Hutchinson emerged, wiping his hands nervously on his leather apron, his usually jovial face creased with worry. "Afternoon, Jacob," Ben called, though his voice carried none of its usual warmth. "Mighty quiet day for business." Jacob tied off his reins and stepped down from the wagon, his boots hitting the dusty street with solid thuds. "Quiet's not always a bad thing, Ben. What's got everyone spooked?" Before Ben could answer, a commotion erupted from the far end of town. Shouts and the sound of running feet drew every eye toward the old mining road that wound down from the hills. A figure stumbled into view, a woman moving with the unsteady gait of someone pushed beyond endurance. Jacob's trained eye took in the details immediately. She was young, perhaps 25, with the distinctive features and dark hair of Apache heritage, though her torn calico dress suggested she'd spent time in white settlements. Blood stained the fabric at her shoulder and thigh, and her moccasined feet left dark prints in the dust. Most telling of all was the look in her dark eyes, not just pain, but a bone-deep terror that spoke of unspeakable experiences. The woman, Sarah Running Deer, though Jacob didn't yet know her name, had been walking for 3 days. Her husband, a peaceful Apache who had tried to build a life between two worlds, had been murdered by a gang of white raiders who'd mistaken his small farm for an easy target. They'd taken everything, his life, their modest possessions, and nearly her dignity before she'd managed to escape into the night. She'd come to Mercy Creek because it was the nearest settlement, clinging to a desperate hope that civilization might offer sanctuary. But as she stumbled down Main Street, that hope withered like grass in drought. Doors slammed shut, window shutters clicked closed. Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's wife, actually crossed herself and muttered what sounded suspiciously like a prayer for protection rather than compassion. The blacksmith, Tom Rivers, emerged from his shop with hammer in hand, not to offer aid but to make clear she should keep moving. "Apache woman," someone whispered, and the word spread like wildfire. "Probably scouting for a war party." "Look at her," Mrs. Garrett hissed to her neighbor. "Covered in blood, what decent woman ends up in such a state?" The cruel mathematics of frontier prejudice played out before Jacob's eyes. In the minds of Mercy Creek citizens, Sarah Running Deer was guilty of multiple sins. She was Apache in a time of rising tensions. She was alone without male protection, suggesting impropriety, and she was wounded in ways that implied shameful circumstances. Each perceived transgression built upon the others until she became, in their collective judgment, untouchable. Sarah reached the center of town and stopped, swaying on her feet. Her voice, when she spoke, was hoarse from thirst and exhaustion, but carried the educated diction of someone who had learned English well. "Please," she said, her words carrying to every ear despite their quiet delivery. "Water. I only need water." The silence that followed was deafening. Jakob watched as grown men who prided themselves on frontier hospitality found suddenly urgent business elsewhere. Women who taught their children about Christian charity discovered pressing household tasks that required immediate attention. Dr. Morrison, the town's physician, appeared in his doorway for a moment. Jakob felt a flicker of hope. Surely a man sworn to heal would offer aid. But Dr. Morrison's gaze flickered to the watching crowd, weighed the social cost of involvement, and retreated inside. The click of his door lock was audible in the stillness. Sarah's knees began to buckle. The combined weight of injury, exhaustion, and rejection finally overcame her strength. She sank toward the dust of Main Street, and Jakob found himself moving before conscious thought could interfere. His boot struck the ground with purpose as he crossed the street. Behind him, he could hear the sharp intake of breath from the gathered crowd, the whispered warnings and dire predictions. None of it mattered. What mattered was the woman collapsing in the street, and a simple truth his German father had beaten into him with leather strap and daily example. You help those who need helping, and you let God sort out the rest. "Easy there," Jakob said, his voice gentle despite its gruff timbre. He knelt beside Sarah, one weathered hand steadying her shoulder. "You're safe now?" Sarah's eyes, clouded with pain and disbelief, focused on his face. She searched his expression for deception or cruelty, but found only genuine concern etched in lines around blue eyes that had seen their own share of hardship. "Water," she whispered again. Jakob looked up at the circle of faces surrounding them, his neighbors, people he'd known for 15 years, watching him as if he'd lost his mind. Ben Hutchinson stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment but his voice firm. "Jacob, you don't understand. She's Apache. With everything that's been happening, I understand she's hurt and needs help." Jacob cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "Someone get me water and clean cloth." When no one moved, Jacob's voice hardened. "Now." The authority in his voice, backed by 15 years of reputation as a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, finally prompted action. A bucket appeared, along with relatively clean rags that Jakob used to clean the worst of Sarah's wounds. They were deep but not fatal, knife cuts rather than bullet wounds, suggesting she'd escaped whatever had befallen her through struggle rather than gunfire. As he worked, Jakob became aware of the weight of judgment pressing down from all sides. He could feel his standing in the community, built over 15 years of honest dealing and quiet integrity, crumbling with each gentle touch he used to tend Sarah's injuries. But he'd learned long ago that a man's opinion of himself mattered more than the opinions of others, and right now his opinion was clear. This was the right thing to do. "Can you travel?" he asked Sarah quietly. She nodded, though the effort cost her. "My ranch is 12 miles north. You'll be safe there." He helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight. "We'll get you healed up and then you can decide what comes next." As he helped Sarah toward his wagon, Sheriff Coleman appeared at his elbow. The lawman's face was grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Jakob, I can't allow this. The woman could be dangerous." Jakob's response was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute finality. "She's coming with me, Jim, unless you're planning to arrest me for Christian charity." The two men locked eyes for a long moment. Sheriff Coleman, like everyone else in Mercy Creek, knew Jacob Mueller's character. He also knew that beneath the rancher's quiet exterior lay iron resolve that had never been successfully challenged. Finally, the sheriff stepped aside. Jacob helped Sarah into his wagon, ignoring the muttered conversations and pointing fingers that followed his every move. As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, he caught sight of Ben Hutchinson's troubled expression. "Jacob," Ben called out, "you sure about this?" Jacob looked back at the town that had been his home for 15 years, at the faces of people who had been his neighbors, his customers, his community. Then he looked at the wounded woman beside him, still trembling from pain and shock. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said, and meant every word. As the wagon rolled north toward the Broken Wheel Ranch, neither Jacob nor the watching townspeople could have imagined that this moment of simple human decency would set in motion events that would transform Mercy Creek forever. The woman he'd just rescued carried with her connections that stretched far beyond the visible horizon, and the debt of gratitude he'd just earned would be repaid in ways that would humble every soul who had turned their back on her this day. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills as the wagon disappeared into the vast prairie, carrying two souls whose lives had just become forever intertwined by the simple decision to choose compassion over comfort. The Broken Wheel Ranch sat like a sturdy promise against the endless Texas prairie, its main house built from native stone and timber that had weathered 15 years of harsh seasons without yielding. Jacob Müller had designed it himself, prioritizing function over beauty, but achieving both through honest craftsmanship and practical design. A wide porch wrapped around three sides, offering shade during scorching summers and protection during winter storms. Behind the house, a barn, corral, and various outbuildings spoke to the methodical expansion of a man who built for permanence rather than profit. As Jacob's wagon creaked up the familiar rutted path, Sarah Running Deer stirred from the exhausted half-sleep that had claimed her during the 12-mile journey. Through pain-clouded eyes, she took in her surroundings, the careful placement of buildings to catch morning sun and avoid winter winds, the quality of the fencing that spoke to a man who took pride in his work, the small touches like the flower garden beside the porch that revealed an unexpected gentleness in the gruff rancher who had rescued her. "Welcome to the Broken Wheel," Jacob said simply, bringing the wagon to a stop near the main house. "It's not much, but it's home." Sarah tried to speak, but found her voice had deserted her entirely. The combination of physical trauma, emotional shock, and the overwhelming relief of finally finding safety had drained her last reserves of strength. Jacob seemed to understand without words, his weathered hands gentle as he helped her down from the wagon. The ranch house's interior reflected its owner's character, clean, orderly, and comfortable without being fancy. Hand-hewn furniture built to last generations shared space with small personal touches. A photograph of a stern-faced couple who had clearly passed their determination to their son, a shelf of well-read books that revealed Jacob's hunger for knowledge, and a mantelpiece displaying a few carefully chosen mementos from his years building the ranch. Jacob settled Sarah in the spare bedroom, a sunny space that had once been intended for the family he'd never quite managed to acquire. Clean sheets, fresh water, and blessed quiet surrounded her as she finally allowed herself to truly rest for the first time in 4 days. Over the following week, as Sarah's physical wounds began to heal under Jacob's careful attention, her story emerged in fragments. She spoke of her husband, Thomas Running Wolf, a gentleman who had tried to bridge the gap between Apache and white worlds by establishing a small farm in the neutral territory between settlements. They had built a modest life together, he teaching her to read and write English, while she showed him traditional ways of living in harmony with the harsh land. Thomas believed peace was possible, Sarah told Jacob one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Her voice carried the weight of dreams destroyed. "He said if we could show both sides that we were just people trying to live good lives, the hatred would fade." Jacob whittled a piece of cedar as he listened, his hands automatically working the wood while his mind processed her words. He'd seen enough of the world to know that hatred rarely responded to reason, but he also recognized the courage it had taken for Sarah and her husband to try. The attack had come without warning, 5 white men claiming to represent some unofficial territorial authority, demanding taxes that everyone knew was simply extortion. When Thomas had tried to reason with them, pointing out that their small farm posed no threat to anyone, the leader had laughed and called him an uppity savage who needed learning. Sarah's voice broke as she described the violence that followed. The men had killed Thomas not in anger, but with casual indifference, as if his life held no more value than that of a troublesome animal. They had ransacked the farm, taking everything of value, and when they turned their attention to Sarah herself, she had fought with the desperation of someone who knew that survival depended entirely on her own strength. "I ran," she whispered, shame coloring her words. I should have stayed with Thomas, should have died beside him, but I ran like a coward. Jakob set down his whittling and looked at her directly. Running when you're outnumbered isn't cowardice. It's survival. Your husband would have wanted you to live. As Sarah's physical strength returned, she insisted on contributing to the ranch work. Despite Jakob's protests that she was still healing, she began helping with cooking, mending, and the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch functioning. Her presence brought an unexpected warmth to the broken wheel, a sense of completion that Jakob hadn't realized he'd been missing. But their peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. On the 10th day of Sarah's stay, Sheriff Coleman arrived at the ranch, his face grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He dismounted slowly, the reluctance clear in every movement, and accepted Jakob's offer of coffee on the porch. Jacob, the sheriff began, stirring his coffee more than necessary, I've got to ask you to reconsider harboring that woman. Her name is Sarah, Jacob replied quietly. And she's not being harbored. She's a guest in my home. Sheriff Coleman sighed, removing his hat and running weathered fingers through thinning hair. The territorial governor's been getting pressure about Apache raids, words spreading that you're sheltering one of them, and some folks are saying it makes you a sympathizer, maybe even a collaborator. Jacob's laugh was short and bitter. Jim, you've known me for 15 years. When have I ever collaborated with anyone on anything? That's just it. Everyone knows you're your own man, but that's not stopping the talk. There's been 3 Apache raids in the past month, and people are scared. They see you protecting an Apache woman, and they start wondering whose side you're really on. From inside the house came the soft sound of Sarah working in the kitchen, humming a melody that blended Apache traditional songs with Christian hymns Thomas had taught her. The sound seemed to emphasize the complexity of the situation. Here was a woman who belonged fully to neither world, caught between cultures in a time when such bridges were viewed with suspicion. She lost her husband to white raiders, Jacob said quietly. She's no more Apache than you or me in any way that matters for your concerns. I believe you, Jacob, but belief isn't the same as proof. And even if it was, the woman's still Apache by blood. And that's enough for most folks right now. Sheriff Coleman leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. There's talk of a vigilance committee being formed. Nothing official, you understand, but some of the hotheads in town are talking about taking matters into their own hands. Jacob felt a cold anger settle in his chest. He'd seen vigilance committees before, knew how quickly righteous anger could become murderous mob mentality. Let them talk. Any man who wants to cause trouble on my land is welcome to try. Jakob, you're one man. Even a man like you can't stand against a mob if they decide to come calling. The sheriff's warning hung heavy in the air between them. Both men understood the reality of frontier justice. When fear overrode law, badges and legal niceties became meaningless. Jakob had worked too hard building his ranch and his reputation to lose either to mob hysteria, but he also couldn't abandon Sarah to whatever fate awaited her in town. That evening, after Sheriff Coleman had ridden away, Jacob found Sarah standing at the kitchen window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. She'd overheard enough of the conversation to understand the position her presence had put him in. I should leave, she said without turning around. You've done more than enough, and I won't have your life destroyed because of me. Jacob moved to stand beside her at the window, looking out at the prairie that stretched endlessly toward horizons he'd learned to call home. Where would you go? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a resignation that cut deeper than her earlier despair. I have people, family. My brother leads a band that moves with the seasons, never staying in one place long enough for the army to find them. If I can reach them, you'd go back to that life, after everything you and Thomas built together. What choice do I have? Sarah turned to face him, and Jacob saw tears she was fighting to contain. I've brought nothing but trouble to every white person who's shown me kindness. At least with my people, I won't be the cause of anyone else's suffering. Jacob studied her face in the lamplight, seeing not just the Apache features that had marked her as an outsider in Mercy Creek, but the intelligence, strength, and fundamental decency that had drawn him to help her in the first place. The idea of her disappearing back into the vast prairie, becoming just another casualty of the hatred that seemed to poison everything it touched, struck him as fundamentally wrong. You're not going anywhere just yet, he said finally. We'll figure something out. But even as he spoke the words, Jakob wondered what solution could possibly exist for a problem rooted in such deep-seated fear and prejudice. He'd saved Sarah's life, but saving her future seemed like a task beyond any one man's ability. Neither of them could have imagined that the solution was already in motion, moving across the prairie with the quiet determination of people who understood debts of honor better than any written law. Sarah's family hadn't forgotten her, and they hadn't forgotten the man who had shown her mercy when no one else would. The next morning would bring the beginning of an answer that would humble every soul in Mercy Creek and teach them the true meaning of justice, loyalty, and the unexpected ways that kindness creates bonds stronger than any fear. 2 weeks had passed since Sheriff Coleman's warning, and an uneasy quiet had settled over both the Broken Wheel Ranch and the town of Mercy Creek. Jakob continued his daily routines with methodical determination, but Sarah noticed the subtle changes, how he checked the horizon more frequently, how his rifle stayed closer at hand, how he positioned himself between her and any approaching riders. The weight of unspoken threats pressed down on them both like an approaching storm. In town, the pressure was building to a dangerous crescendo. What had started as nervous whispers in Hutchinson's general store had evolved into open meetings at the Silver Dollar Saloon, where men fortified their courage with whiskey and their resolve with increasingly inflammatory rhetoric. The unofficial leader of these gatherings was Marcus Webb, a failed prospector who had found more success in stirring up trouble than he'd ever found in gold. Webb stood before a gathering of 20 men on a humid Tuesday evening, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who understood how to transform fear into action. "Gentlemen, we all know Jakob Müller's reputation as a good man, but good men can be deceived by cunning enemies. That Apache woman he's harboring has had 2 weeks to send signals to her people, 2 weeks to plan whatever devilry they're cooking up." Ben Hutchinson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his conscience warring with his business sense. Jakob Müller had been a steady customer for 15 years, never caused trouble, always paid his debts. But the men gathered in the saloon represented a significant portion of the town's adult male population, and their mood was growing uglier with each passing day. "Maybe we should talk to Sheriff Coleman again," Ben suggested weakly. "Let the law handle this proper-like." Webb's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Jim Coleman's a good enough sheriff for rustlers and drunks, but this is bigger than local law. This is about the survival of our community, our families, our way of life." He gestured toward the window, beyond which the prairie stretched dark and mysterious under the star-filled sky. "How many of you sleep sound at night knowing there's an Apache woman 12 miles from here? Probably already told her savage relatives about every defensive weakness we have." The murmur of agreement that rippled through the room carried undertones of violence that made Ben's stomach clench with dread. He'd seen lynch mobs before, knew how quickly righteous anger could become murderous frenzy, but he also knew that once such forces were unleashed, stopping them became nearly impossible. "Doctor." Morrison, who had remained silent through most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "What exactly are you proposing, Webb?" "I'm proposing we give Jakob Müller one chance to do the right thing. We ride out there tomorrow, explain the situation, and ask him politely to turn the woman over to proper authorities. If he refuses—" Webb let the sentence hang unfinished, but his meaning was clear to everyone present. "And what proper authorities would those be?" asked Tom Rivers, the blacksmith, though his question carried more curiosity than challenge. "The territorial militia's been authorized to relocate hostile Indians to designated areas," Webb replied smoothly. "One Apache woman shouldn't be too much for them to handle." What Webb didn't mention, what perhaps he didn't even know, was that the territorial militia's methods of relocation had become increasingly brutal as pressure mounted to clear all Native Americans from valuable grazing and farming land. Sarah Running Deer wouldn't be relocated, she would simply disappear, another casualty of the systematic destruction of her people. Meanwhile, at the Broken Wheel Ranch, Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching Jakob repair a section of fence damaged by the previous week's storm. His movements were economical and precise, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he frequently paused to scan the horizon. The man who had saved her life was now trapped by his own decency, caught between his principles and the growing hostility of his community. Sarah had made her decision. That evening, as they sat on the porch sharing their customary after-dinner coffee, she broached the subject that had been weighing on her heart. "Jacob, "I've been thinking about what I should do." He set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "And what have you decided?" "I'm going to leave tomorrow morning, early, before anyone from town might see me go. I'll head north toward the Canadian border, maybe find work in one of the railroad towns where nobody knows my story." Jakob was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the star-filled sky above the prairie. When he spoke, his voice carried a sadness that surprised them both. "You know you don't have to leave. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be." "Jakob," Sarah's voice broke slightly, "you've given me more kindness than I had any right to expect. But I won't have your blood on my hands. These men from town, they're not going to be satisfied with warnings and threats forever. Let me worry about the men from town." Sarah reached across the small space between their chairs and placed her hand over his calloused fingers. "You're a good man, Jakob Müller, but you're just one man. And I've learned that sometimes the right thing to do is know when to walk away." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both understanding that this might be their last evening together. The bond that had formed between them over the past 2 weeks was deeper than either had expected. Not romantic love, but something equally profound. The recognition of kindred spirits who understood what it meant to stand alone against an indifferent world. What neither of them knew was that Sarah's family had not abandoned her to fate. 3 days earlier, a young Apache scout named Joseph Swift Arrow had located the Broken Wheel Ranch and observed from a distance the care with which Jacob treated Sarah. The scout had then ridden hard for 2 days to reach the hidden canyon where Sarah's brother, Chief Michael Running Deer, maintained his small but fiercely loyal band. Michael Running Deer was a man caught between worlds, like his sister. Educated at a mission school as a child, he spoke perfect English and understood white customs, but he had chosen to reject assimilation in favor of preserving what remained of his people's traditional ways. His band of 40 warriors represented the remnants of several Apache groups, united not by traditional tribal boundaries, but by their refusal to accept reservation life. When Joseph Swift Arrow reported what he had observed at the Broken Wheel Ranch, Michael had listened with growing amazement. A white rancher had taken in his sister when she was wounded and desperate, had cared for her without asking for payment or favors, and was now facing persecution from his own people because of his kindness. Such behavior was so contrary to Michael's experience with whites that he had initially questioned the scout's report. But Joseph was reliable and observant. His description of the rancher's respectful treatment of Sarah, his willingness to defend her against community pressure, and his obvious genuine concern for her welfare painted a picture of a man whose character transcended racial boundaries. Michael had spent 2 days in council with his warriors, discussing what response such unprecedented kindness deserved. The Apache understanding of honor was complex and demanding. Debts of gratitude carried weight across generations, and the man who had saved Sarah's life had earned consideration that extended far beyond individual reciprocity. Now, as Sarah prepared to leave the Broken Wheel Ranch and Jacob steeled himself for whatever confrontation tomorrow might bring, 40 Apache warriors were moving silently through the night toward Mercy Creek. They traveled with the patient stealth that had made their people legendary, covering ground at a pace that would have exhausted cavalry horses while leaving barely a trace of their passage. Michael Running Deer rode at their head, his face painted for war, but his intentions focused on justice rather than revenge. The white man who had shown mercy to his sister would receive protection whether he wanted it or not. And the town that had turned its back on a wounded woman would learn what it meant to face the consequences of their cruelty. The moon was setting as the Apache band reached the hills overlooking Mercy Creek, positioning themselves with military precision around the sleeping town. By dawn, every soul in that community would understand that kindness creates bonds stronger than fear, and that justice sometimes arrives from the most unexpected directions. The reckoning was about to begin, and neither Jacob Müller nor the citizens of Mercy Creek could imagine how profoundly their world was about to change. Dawn broke over Mercy Creek with deceptive tranquility, the golden light painting the humble buildings and dusty streets in shades of amber and rose. Early risers emerged to tend their morning chores, unaware that 40 pairs of eyes watched their every movement from the surrounding hills. The Apache warriors had positioned themselves with the patience and precision of hunters, creating an invisible ring around the town that could tighten into a deadly noose at their chief's command. At the Broken Wheel Ranch, Sarah Running Deer stood in the pre-dawn darkness, packing her few belongings into a canvas bag. She moved quietly, hoping to slip away before Jacob woke, sparing them both the pain of final goodbyes. But as she stepped onto the porch, she found him waiting in the darkness, 2 cups of coffee steaming in the cool morning air. "Thought you might want something warm before you traveled," he said simply, offering her one of the cups. They stood together in companionable silence, watching the eastern horizon lighten with the promise of sunrise. Neither spoke of the danger Sarah faced traveling alone, or the emptiness her departure would leave at the ranch. Some truths were too large for words. "Jacob," Sarah said finally, "I want you to know that these weeks with you have given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope that good people still exist in this world." Before Jacob could respond, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning quiet. A large group of riders was approaching fast from the direction of town, their silhouettes dark against the lightening sky. Jacob counted at least 15 men, and his experienced eye noted the purposeful way they rode. This wasn't a social visit. "Get inside," Jacob told Sarah, his voice calm but urgent. "Whatever happens, stay in the house." Sarah's heart clenched with fear, not for herself but for the man who had risked everything to protect her. "Jacob, there are too many of them. Please, just let them take me." "Don't sacrifice yourself for—" "Nobody's taking anybody anywhere," Jacob interrupted, his weathered hand moving to rest on the rifle he'd propped against the porch railing. "This is my land, and I decide who's welcome on it." The riders thundered into the ranch yard in a cloud of dust and barely controlled aggression. Marcus Webb led the group, his face flushed with the righteousness of a man convinced of his own moral superiority. Behind him rode most of Mercy Creek's adult male population, though Jacob noted with some satisfaction that several faces he'd expected to see were notably absent, men whose consciences had ultimately overruled their fears. "Morning, Jacob," Webb called out, his voice carrying false joviality that fooled no one. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Perfect for settling unfinished business." Jacob stepped down from the porch, moving with deliberate calm despite the odds stacked against him. His rifle remained in his hands, but pointed toward the ground, ready for use but not immediately threatening. "Marcus, gentlemen, little early for social calls, isn't it?" "Now, Jacob, let's not pretend we don't all know why we're here," Webb replied, his manufactured friendliness beginning to slip. "You've had 2 weeks to come to your senses about harboring that Apache woman. Time's up for reasonable discussion. Far as I know, offering hospitality to a wounded woman isn't against any law in Texas," Jacob replied mildly. "You boys having trouble sleeping, worrying about Christian charity being practiced in your vicinity?" Several of the riders shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Ben Hutchinson, in particular, seemed to be having serious second thoughts about the wisdom of this confrontation, but Webb pressed forward, his voice rising with manufactured indignation. "That woman is Apache, Jacob. She's probably already sent word to her savage relatives about our defenses, our weaknesses. How many innocent women and children have to die before you stop playing the noble fool? The only woman in danger here is the one you're threatening to drag away from lawful sanctuary," Jacob replied, his voice hardening slightly. "Sarah Running Deer lost her husband to white raiders. She came to Mercy Creek wounded and desperate, asking for nothing more than water. Every single one of you turned your backs on her." "Because we're not idiots," Webb shouted, his careful control finally cracking. "We know what Apaches do to white settlers. We know—" His words were cut off by a sound that froze every man in the yard, the whistle of an arrow passing close enough to part Webb's hat brim before embedding itself in the fence post behind him. The message was unmistakable. You are surrounded, you are outmatched, and your lives depend on the restraint of those who hold you in their sights. From the hills around the ranch came a sight that would be burned into the memory of every man present for the rest of their lives. Apache warriors rose from concealment like spirits materializing from the earth itself, their painted faces and traditional weapons creating a tableau that belonged more to legend than reality. They appeared on every ridge, behind every boulder, along every approach route, a perfect tactical deployment that demonstrated just how completely the white men had walked into a trap. At the center of this display of controlled power rode Chief Michael Running Deer, his bearing regal despite the simplicity of his traditional dress. He approached the ranch yard slowly, giving the surrounded men time to fully comprehend their situation. Behind him rode 2 other warriors, but the rest remained in position, their weapons ready but not yet aimed to kill. Michael dismounted with fluid grace and walked directly to Jakob, his intelligent eyes taking in every detail of the white rancher's bearing and demeanor. When he spoke, his English was perfect, educated, and carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command. "You are Jakob Müller," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. I am Michael Running Deer. Sarah is my sister." Jakob nodded, understanding beginning to dawn in his weathered features. "She spoke of you, said you were a good man caught in bad times." Michael's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "She said the same of you." He turned to face the mounted white men, his gaze moving from face to face with measured deliberation. "Which of you turned away when my sister asked for water?" The silence that followed was deafening. Several men tried to avoid Michael's gaze, but there was nowhere to hide in the open ranch yard. Webb, his earlier bluster completely evaporated, sat frozen in his saddle like a rabbit caught in lantern light. "All of you," Michael said finally, his voice carrying a sadness that was somehow more terrible than anger would have been. "Every single one of you saw a wounded woman begging for help, and you turned away." His gaze settled on Jakob. "Every one but this man." From the house came movement, and Sarah appeared on the porch. Her face was streaked with tears, not of fear but of overwhelming relief and gratitude. She had given up her brother and his warriors for lost, had resigned herself to facing the world alone. To see them here, ready to protect both her and the man who had protected her, was almost more than her heart could bear. "Brother," she called softly in Apache, her voice carrying across the silent yard. Michael smiled then, the first genuine warmth he'd shown since arriving. "Sister," he replied in English, ensuring the white men understood the familial bond they had ignored when they dismissed Sarah as just another Apache woman. "Are you well?" "I am well," Sarah answered, switching to English as well. "This man, Jakob Müller, has been kinder to me than my own people would have expected from any white man. He saved my life and asked nothing in return." Michael nodded gravely, then turned back to face the mounted townsmen. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the ranch yard and highlighting the complete tactical superiority of the Apache positions. Every escape route was covered, every defensive position compromised. The men of Mercy Creek were entirely at the mercy of people they had spent years viewing as savage enemies. "My sister tells me that one of you is a doctor," Michael said, his gaze finding Dr. Morrison in the crowd. "When she begged for medical attention, what did you do?" Dr. Morrison's face flushed red with shame. I went inside, locked my door." "And you?" Michael's attention shifted to Ben Hutchinson. "Own the store where food and supplies are sold. When a starving woman asked for help, what did you do?" "I turned away," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. One by one, Michael catalogued their failures of basic human decency, not with shouting or threats, but with the quiet persistence of a man establishing facts for the record. With each acknowledgement of their cowardice, the weight of collective shame grew heavier on the mounted men. Finally, Michael's gaze settled on Marcus Webb, the self-appointed leader who had organized this morning's confrontation. "And you, who speak so boldly of protecting your community, what did you do when my sister needed protection?" Webb's mouth worked soundlessly for several moments before he managed to croak out, We were afraid. Apache raids. You thought my wounded, starving sister was a threat to armed men in a fortified town," Michael said, his voice carrying quiet contempt. "You thought a woman begging for water was your enemy." The tactical situation was clear to everyone present. The Apache warriors could have killed every man in that yard before any of them could clear leather, much less mount an effective defense. The townsmen were completely at the mercy of people they had dismissed as savage, and that mercy was being demonstrated in the most powerful way possible, through restraint. "You came here to take my sister," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger. "You brought rifles and rope and the courage that comes from superior numbers. You planned to drag her away to face whatever justice you thought appropriate for the crime of being Apache and asking for help." Webb tried to speak, but Michael raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture. "But my sister is under the protection of Jakob Müller, and Jakob Müller is under the protection of my warriors. This protection extends to his ranch, his cattle, and his property, for as long as he chooses to honor the friendship he has shown to my family." Jacob felt a chill of recognition at the formal language Michael was using. This wasn't just a rescue, it was the establishment of a formal alliance, complete with territorial implications that would reshape the power dynamics of the entire region. "Furthermore," Michael continued, "any man who threatens Jakob Müller or attempts harm to my sister will answer to me personally. This protection extends to his business relationships with your town." His gaze swept over the mounted men with unmistakable meaning. "I suggest you conduct your future dealings with him accordingly." The implications hit the townsmen like physical blows. Jakob Müller had just become the most protected man in 3 territories, backed by warriors whose tactical skills and local knowledge made them more dangerous than any cavalry unit. More importantly, he had become their economic lifeline to an Apache leader whose goodwill could mean the difference between peace and constant warfare. But Michael wasn't finished. "There is, however, the matter of justice for the insult shown to my sister." The word sent a ripple of terror through the mounted men. They had all heard stories of Apache justice, tales of torture and slow death that haunted frontier nightmares. Several men began edging their horses backward, but the surrounding warriors made it clear that retreat was not an option. "Each of you will contribute $20 to a fund that will help my sister rebuild the life that was taken from her when her husband was murdered," Michael announced. "This money will be delivered to Jakob Müller within 1 week, along with written apologies for your treatment of a wounded woman seeking sanctuary." The relief that swept through the townsmen was palpable. $20 was significant money, but it was money they could afford to lose. Their lives, which they had expected to forfeit, were being returned to them for a price they could pay. "And," Michael added, his voice taking on a harder edge, "if any harm comes to my sister or to Jakob Müller, if so much as a fence post on this ranch is damaged by malicious hands, my warriors will visit your town in the darkness, and our next conversation will be conducted very differently." The threat hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire, visible and ominous but not yet burning. Every man present understood that they had just witnessed something unprecedented, Apache justice that included mercy, but mercy with very clear boundaries. Marcus Webb, his leadership pretensions completely shattered, could only nod mutely. The other men followed suit, their earlier bravado replaced by the humbling realization that their intended victim had proven to be under protection more powerful than any they could challenge. "You may go," Michael said simply. "Remember what you have learned here." The townsmen didn't need to be told twice. They wheeled their horses and rode away with considerably less noise and bluster than they had arrived with, leaving clouds of dust that slowly settled in the morning stillness. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Michael turned to Jacob with an expression of genuine respect. "My sister chose her protector well. A man who stands alone against many for the sake of what is right. Such men are rare in any race." Jacob extended his hand, and Michael clasped it firmly. "Your sister is welcome here for as long as she chooses to stay," Jacob said, "and so are you and your people, should you ever need sanctuary." Sarah descended from the porch, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her brother. The reunion was tender and brief. Both understood that Michael's warriors needed to withdraw before army patrols might discover their presence so close to white settlements. "Will you come with us?" Michael asked his sister gently. Sarah looked at Jacob, then back at her brother. "Thomas and I dreamed of building a bridge between our peoples. I think that bridge might be here, on this ranch, with this man who shows that decency has no color." Michael nodded, understanding her choice. "Then you have found your place, but you will always have a home with us as well." As the Apache warriors melted back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared, Jacob and Sarah stood together on the porch of the Broken Wheel Ranch. The morning sun was warm on their faces, and for the first time in weeks, the future seemed filled with possibility instead of threat. In town, 20 men would spend the rest of their lives telling the story of the day they learned that kindness creates alliances stronger than any army, and that justice sometimes rides in from directions no one expects. The $20 each would contribute would help Sarah establish a small school on Jacob's ranch, where Apache and white children would learn together. building the bridge of understanding that she and her late husband had dreamed of creating. But that morning, as they watched the sun climb higher over the vast Texas prairie, Jacob and Sarah simply stood in comfortable silence, two souls who had found in each other the rare gift of unconditional acceptance. The gesture of offering water to a desperate woman had grown into something neither could have imagined, a friendship that would transform not just their lives, but the entire character of a frontier community that had learned in the most dramatic way possible the true meaning of Christian charity and the unexpected power of doing what is right. The Broken Wheel Ranch would prosper for generations, becoming known throughout Texas as a place where people of all backgrounds could find sanctuary and respect. And in the town of Mercy Creek, no traveler would ever again be turned away from a request for basic human kindness, for the citizens had learned that mercy given returns multiplied, while mercy denied can exact a price higher than any community can afford to pay. The story of Jacob Mueller and Sarah Running Deer became legend in that part of Texas, passed down through generations as proof that in a world often divided by fear and prejudice, individual acts of courage and compassion can create bonds strong enough to bridge any divide. It was a lesson written in dust and blood, sealed with Apache honor, and remembered every time someone chose kindness over comfort, courage over conformity. Justice had indeed risen with the dawn, and its message would echo across the frontier for years to come. Treat all people with dignity, for you never know when angels might be watching from the hills.